Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Jeremy Carl, who is the author of The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. He's worked in government and in public policy, so-called, for many years, has quite a CV, which we open with. In this conversation, we talk about public policy, we talk about the bureaucratic state, and why America's ruling leftist elite is allowing for or even sponsoring or forwarding anti-white racism and what that means for our country and how to forestall that without a backlash that leads to violence or further entrenchment of identitarianism. I find Jeremy to be an immensely intelligent and well-read individual. You can check out his books via the links below as well as links to his socials. And if you appreciate this content, consider liking, subscribing, and donating via the tip jars that are placed also in the description. Without further ado, here is Jeremy Carl. So what is your origin story, Jeremy Carl?
Yeah, so the origin story, I guess that goes pretty far back, but I'll just give the quick bio. I grew up in North Carolina, did my undergrad at Yale, was spent some time in the business world, ended up kind of going to live in India and work on public policy issues for a little while after getting a master's degree at the Kennedy School over at Harvard, kind of doing public policy. Did that for a while and kind of wound up going to Stanford to go do a doctorate, and then wound up from there at the Hoover Institution, where I was a fellow for a decade. And I was actually mostly at that time professionally working on environment and resource issues, which is the same thing I did in the Trump administration. So nothing kind of related really directly to what we're going to talk about today, but just had to give a little bit of the complete origin story. But as I was at Hoover, I found myself kind of increasingly drawn to writing about these issues of kind of race relations and identity and nationalism and immigration that kind of make up a lot of my book. And just increasingly, I kind of spent some time in the Trump administration and then was at the Claremont Institute, which is where I am now, my home. I'm a senior fellow there. And I spend most of my time kind of writing about the issues that are related to what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Demographics and destiny. Yeah.
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 What could you kind of give me an idea of what you mean by public policy? Like, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I'd say it just means you're working on kind of policy issues. So to become either a policy advisor or a policy maker. So that means I spent most of my time in an advisory or writing role, but I have spent some time as an implementer. I managed a 10,000 person bureaucracy when I was in the Trump administration in the Department of the Interior. And I also have kind of advised various very senior political officials who I will not name to protect their innocence. But I mean, not that there's any scandal associated with it, but just given that we're talking about controversial issues today, I won't not going to associate them with that, since I advise them often on very separate matters.
What is your general attitude towards the bureaucratic apparatus of the state? Just to kind of zoom out to understand, like, from your experience, and then also from your political point of view.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge critic. I mean, I think that we live in many ways in a post-constitutional order. This is something that my Claremont colleagues often remark on. I think the administrative state, or the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, is an extra constitutional kind of organization that has usurped a bunch of power that it shouldn't have. Now, this is not somehow a kind of uniquely American situation. I mean, you could go back to ancient China and look at the kind of power accumulated by various bureaucrats who passed the foreign exams 3,000 years ago. I mean, literally. And so I think there's something to be said just about this being kind of a feature, perhaps, of the governmental process once a state has been around for a certain amount of time. But the reality is these groups and bureaucrats have twisted the rules and accumulated a great deal of unaccountable bureaucratic power for themselves. I certainly had this, the number of people who were under me at the Department of the Interior who were actually interested in advancing the lawful policies that the president had entrusted me to move forward were incredibly small, and the number of people who were unlawfully trying to thwart those policies was very, very high. And the kind of interesting thing was that I was not a career DC guy, but most of the other senior politicals that I was working with were. And they'd kind of been so captured by the system that they just sort of took this as a matter of course, that this is how it should be. And I was like, no, these guys work for us. Um,
Hmm.
and to be fair, actually, my boss, Secretary of the Interior, actually wrote a book afterwards entitled "You Work for Me." And that's kind of the idea. But believe me, that is not, unfortunately, the way that the pure permanent bureaucratic apparatus tends to view things.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the ability for that system to be reformed or at least restrained?
I'm pessimistic, but only mildly pessimistic. I think we certainly it would help a lot if we got Trump back in office because I think at least directionally, I mean, I think intuitively, as Trump often does, he understands kind of the problem, even if he doesn't kind of grasp the details or how you'd move the apparatus, but he understands at least that the problem is a problem, which puts him one up on pretty much every other Republican presidential candidate since at least Reagan,
Hmm.
if not going before that. And I think he has people around him, including some very smart friends of mine, who actually want to do something about the problem and have intelligent, ways that they might go about that. On the other hand, this system is so entrenched, they can tie things up in the courts. So, I don't know. I'm not super optimistic, but I don't think it's impossible. Maybe if you get a DeSantis or whoever succeeds Trump, assuming that Trump is able to win and make some progress, maybe they can kind of pick up the ball and continue to run with it. But
Hmm.
it probably is something that to really fix it, you'd need multiple presidential administrations to
Yeah.
even take a bite at the apple.
It's a long-term stretch goal, let's
Yeah,
say.
that's
And
correct.
do you see the political will to follow through on that, or in what direction do you think that political will can be gathered and focused
Yeah.
on that?
I mean, in the majority, no. I mean, the average congressman is just there to be, collect power and collect a paycheck. And even if
Hmm.
they're not, they're usually not that smart and strategic. We have guys on our
You don't
team.
say.
Yeah, we have guys on our team who absolutely are. I mean, that's the thing. I won't bash everybody because there are some genuinely good and well-meaning congressmen. And even among those who I have some pretty substantial disagreements with, there's more who are not completely hopeless than you might think. They're very constrained by the system they're in. And
Yeah.
if I were to go into Congress, I would quickly find myself constrained by that same system. And if you really fight the system, if you're like a Matt Gaetz or a Thomas Massey or somebody like that, you kind of see the amount of flack that you generate. And I say that, I mean, I agree with those guys most of the time, but even when I don't agree with them, I mean, they're definitely kind of trying to make change.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really hard. I mean, I think the Pendleton Civil Service Act of, I think it was 1883, is kind of the most underrated cause of the destruction of modern government, that you can't kind of fire bureaucrats. It's a real problem.
Really? Why would they ever institute such a law to protect themselves from accountability?
Well, I mean, you sort of got it. Although, I mean, to be fair, I mean, again, I try to always, I think Gordon Wood, one of my favorite historians, says that you're kind of, when we're looking at history, if you're doing it properly, you kind of have to restore all the possibilities of action that existed at that time to the
Yeah.
actors who were doing it. That's the way you have to be fair, as a historian. And I think this was in the wake of the assassination of President Garfield by a disgruntled civil service applicant. And people just thought, gosh, this is getting out of hand. The spoil system is getting out of hand. Let's professionalize it. I mean, again, this is pre-communism. It's pre everything. It's kind of proto-scientific management almost. Like let's
Yeah.
just professionalize this. And I don't think it was an insane thing to do at the time, but it quickly metastasized into something very negative.
Yeah. Could we go back just a little bit? You dropped something from China's history called the foreign exam. Could you just tell me what that
Oh,
is?
not
That's
for an
interesting.
example. It was, and I'm embarrassed because I took so many Chinese history courses as an undergrad. I should have the exact name for this. But basically, um, civil servants in China for literally thousands of years. I mean, at least I don't know how far it actually went back, but I think to at least Confucian times. Um, stood for essentially competitive civil service exams, would be the rough equivalent. And I mean, they didn't, of course, focus on the same sorts of things that they necessarily did would today. They're very much, how much do you know these classics and things
Okay.
like that. But they were kind of some sort of a rough IQ test and literacy test and everything else. And that was kind of who ran the imperial state in many cases a lot. I mean, the eunuchs and the emperors, there were various power bases, but
Wow.
but those kind of civil servants in China got a lot of power. And so again, my point is that this is not a unique
Yeah.
because you could, yeah,
They gated themselves. The
right, right. And this is just the
ideological.
nature of power. I mean, almost even to complain about it feels like you don't really understand what's going on, right?
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
you should expect that, especially after a certain amount of time, a system will take on these characteristics. And simply, rather than be really mad about that, we just need to think of how we can have an effective kind of revolution. And I don't use that in a violent sense, but in a sense of really beginning to what I call restore democratic accountability to the system, because that's what it is. The
Yeah.
left would call it something else.
What would they call it?
Oh, they'd call it a coup or, a
Oh,
dictatorship or whatever. I mean, it's the idea that the president should control the president's government, subject, of course, to the laws made by Congress, right? I mean,
yeah.
but that the president should control the executive branch. And people like my friend John Yoo talk about unitary executive theory. And I think that's kind of indicative and kind of rolled into all that.
Okay. So thank you very much for just giving me the lay of the land. I like to frame any conversation. So we're going to get into your book, The Unprotected Class. With regard to this bureaucratic apparatus, the deep state, whatever we want to call it, and mass immigration, mass reshuffling of the ethnic constitution of the American civil
Yeah.
body, how does that work together or in conjunction with itself? Um,
Oh, I think
and
there's
is that
absolutely.
the proper framing or the proper background to talk
I
about
think
this? Or
certainly in a sense, I mean, in the broadest sense that everything we've done, starting with the expansion of the franchise, in the early 19th century, arguably, was all about kind of giving more and more control to people who could be more easily manipulated by the system. Um, so, I mean, this is now kind of getting into a much grander subject than I go into in my book, but um,
I love it.
like who really benefits from the kind of I voted sticker, from the push to vote? If you're not particularly motivated and you're not particularly informed, where do you tend to be getting your information? Well, you tend to be getting it at that point from apparatuses that are controlled by the state in either directly or indirectly. They're either controlled by the state or they're favored by the state. And so when you have lots of kind of low information participation, that's kind of an inevitable consequence of that system. And again, I mean, there's balance to this, right? Because you want, at least if you think that democracy has any validity at all, and there are obviously folks like Curtis Yarvin, et cetera, who would challenge that premise right off the top. But if you're like me and you think that there is certainly a role for a more popular sovereignty type perspective, um, then you don't want to lock things up so much that you're kind of demanding an IQ test or a literacy test or something like that just to be able to participate in the government. Yet, having said that, when we diffuse power out, and this is where immigration comes into it, people who don't even speak the language in many cases, who, of course, technically should not be able to become citizens, but that's a separate issue. People who are kind of very dependent, as many immigrants are, they're disproportionately dependent. All those people are the ideal citizens, and I use that term in air quotes, for a regime that wants to concentrate power amongst itself and its kind of people it can control. So what they fear is, of course, a highly informed, highly engaged citizenry. That's what kind of power fears most.
Yeah. But isn't it self-defeating for power? So a large part of your book, and I've only seen excerpts, I've been going through excerpts, so I haven't read the whole thing, but you detail at least what I call the equitocracy as opposed to the meritocracy. Like they pick a target group and then they raise up that group. Let's just say black women are incredibly
Right.
favored by Biden's judicial
Right.
staffing, right? And some would even say is the face of that administration is the same class of person who doesn't perform optimally
Right.
in a meritocracy, but in an equitocracy, it
Right.
has some sort of air of justice. If stocking up your administration or your apparatus of power with low performing individuals, doesn't that isn't aren't you working against it's isn't aren't you making
Well,
it
I mean, I think it depends. It's a balance like anything is in a democratic polity, right? You need to have enough people who actually know what they're doing um, to run the apparatus, and yet
yeah
you've got to also distribute patronage. And again, I think this is you go to Tammany Hall, you would have observed the same thing. And I think the Democrats, and you're particularly, I mean, we've been able to document this pretty clearly. I mean, they've really moved to this high-low coalition against the middle. So you sort of have this large percentage of the most dependent, perhaps least competent citizens on average. I'm speaking very, very broadly, who are kind of a Democratic electoral base, and they are kind of managed and run by actually the highest end of the intelligentsia and the people who control the cultural apparatus and some very, very bright people, but really the elite. I mean, as much as as much as I disdain them and I disagree with everything that they do, um, they are kind of the high and low is in conflict with the middle. And this is something that was observed way back by Sam Francis. And even before then, if you were to go back to Francis, Francis was kind of a student of James Burnham. And I think Burnham talked a lot about this as well when he talked about the managerial revolution and some of these things going all the way back to the 1930s and afterwards.
okay. So what's the constitution of that high-low alliance, and how do you explore that, and why is it to do with race specifically or ethnicity
Well,
specifically?
it doesn't always have to be.
Yeah.
I mean, race is one vector you'd have it. I'd say with the Democrats' constant talking about abortion, sex can be another one. I mean, actually, kind of one of the interesting things, right? The Democrats are very effective at kind of saying, well, the Republicans don't get women's support. There's a low war on women, et cetera. If you look at the actual voting preferences, married women, along with married men and even single men, very strongly, married men being the strongest, support the GOP. The Democrats are the party of single women, right? That's like actually their
Hmm.
constituency. When you at least look at it from a gender perspective, a gender and sex perspective.
Yeah.
So that's one way you can do it. Race is another one. It's really visible. It's really easy. We've structured our system, unfortunately, as I write about in my book, so that there's a lot of bennies to be given on the basis of race. And so it's only natural in that context that the Democrats might choose to organize around that kind of very powerful frame.
Okay. Could you speak to these bennies and why they're distributed around race and why that's problematic or why that was necessary at a time? If we
Right.
what you said about granting restoring the possibility space of the people who
Right.
instituted, let's say, the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. So, and that's, I'm glad you mentioned this because I think one of the, this is a book that is, it's pretty leaning far out. And I think people, the reviewers, and they've been great, have picked up on this. But I think they've also picked up that I've tried to talk about this controversial subject in a responsible way. So that's actually been really, really
Hmm.
gratifying. I've had some very extreme groups who have kind of praised the book, but I've also had a lot of people who are sort of a little more in the moderate center say, "Wow, this is a very balanced treatment." So that's great. I mean, that's what I was really, really trying to do while not kind of
Hmm.
no, while not hiding the facts. Um, so, kind of having said that, I would say I'm not quite as critical as some people have been. Richard Hanania, my Claremont colleague, Christopher Caldwell, who wrote a terrific book on the Civil Rights Act,
Yeah.
of the Civil Rights Act itself, because I think if you go back to that time, you can understand why people felt that there were real problems that it was addressing. I mean, okay, real problems where people were not being treated in an equal fashion just on the basis of their skin color, which I would argue is the same thing that's going on today. And the Civil Rights Act was a blunt instrument to solve that. And I think it's really easy
Hmm.
ex post facto to go back and say, it was really bad for the following reasons. And to be fair, there were some people even at the time who I think came up with correct reasons why we should be concerned about it. But I'm not a kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't feel the need to put the Civil Rights Act of 64 on trial as a kind of intellectual exercise just to kind of rile people up. What I would say is we are as far away from that in time as they were to the Wright brothers. And we just have a totally different set of issues we're dealing with right now. We're not dealing with, you get rid of every civil rights act imaginable today, and nobody wouldn't be being served at lunch counters. Nobody wouldn't be being served at hotels, but you'd still actually have a lot of anti-white racial discrimination in employment, in education, in other areas. So let's kind of restore freedom of association and reorient whatever civil rights regime we do have to, I mean, basically scaling back a lot of what's done, but to the problems that we actually have today rather than the problems of 60 years ago.
Okay. Why is America enamored with civil rights? It seems to me to be the cathedral that
Yeah.
defines our modern identity as Americans.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partially because it's a way the Democrats who control the intellectual apparatus. It's a the I'll talk about this later probably when we get into, but you talk about sort of legitimating ideologies. This is a phrase that was used by the 20th century sociologist C. Wright Mills, which basically to say like can't just go do stuff that might seem like offensive. You can't just take things from people in 21st century America. So you need a legitimating ideology to kind of justify doing various things that you might want to do. So civil rights serves as a convenient legitimating ideology to do a lot of things that the Democrat coalition wants to do just because they want to do them, because they perceive them to be in their own material interests. So I think that's what it is. I think we have a deep sense going back to the Christian heritage of this country of, social justice is not the right term because that's very freighted, but a notion of, a notion of kind of at least equality before the law, even if it was imperfect, is very much baked into our founding. And I think that's a good thing about the founding. I mean, when we talk about all men being created equal, again, we're obviously short of that when we started
Yeah.
the operation, but that was at least a kind of animating principle in the way that divine right of kings might have been for a monarchy in Europe. And so I think that a certain amount of this is built into the American DNA. And then, of course, there are unscrupulous actors who've kind of just picked up and run with this. And I think the good thing is people are beginning, and I'm certainly one of them, to kind of challenge the civil rights apparatus more directly. And I think if we don't do that, as I write in my book, we're not going to be able to make any real progress on this issue.
So if we can't make progress, what's the alternative to progress on this issue? If unchecked, where
Yeah.
are we headed? Where's America
Well,
headed?
I kind of I closed my second or my real first real substantive chapter by saying, hey, look, um, this sort of thing often ends in violent conflict if we don't check it, and that's not good for anybody. And what I'm really talking about there is kind of multiracial democratic um, polities with systems that tend to be more winner take all. The history of those is not great in terms of the propensity for fighting and squabbling and violence. It's very difficult to maintain those. Now, that's not to say it never happens. You can point to the Roman Empire existing for quite a long time, being organized around principles other than ethnicity that kind of kept it together at the same time as the British historian Peter Heather, who's written a couple good books about the fall of the Roman Empire, point out the real kind of precipitating event, arguably, in doing that was when the Romans let the barbarians in, and I'm using the barbarians as the term they would have used, as and they were legitimate refugees, unlike the economic migrants. They were legitimate refugees from the rapacious Huns, but those were the people who ended up turning around a few years later, and in I think 378. Doing the events that eventually would precipitate the sack of Rome, the Western Roman Empire, less than a century later.
Hmm.
So,
I guess one difficulty with this issue, because it stands in contradiction to our liberal values of equality before the law, is the aspect of ethnic solidarity. You
Right.
can have, but at the same time, if you look at it from a Democrat point of view, black power good, white guilt good, white power bad,
Right.
black servility bad. We really hesitate, and even I do, to want to pursue white identity, even if it is protective of
Right.
me. But at the same time, the more it gets eroded, the more I find that the complaints from white identitarians are legitimate. So
Yeah.
how do we thread this needle? How do you personally frame that issue in a way that polite society can
Yeah.
entertain?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, and it's literally threading the needle, right? And I do address this right up front in the book because I think it's really important. I sort of say, look, I think a politics of whiteness is inferior to a kind of emphasis on equality before the law. At the same time, where I do go a little bit further than some other people, is that there is a tendency to frame like basically what I would describe, and you said this in a different way, but here's the way I would say it. Um, the left has organized kind of using anti-white racism as a principle, and they've organized on unapologetically racial lines to do a lot of things in this country. The right, by contrast, has kind of made these very gauzy appeals to all men are created equal and et cetera, and content of their character and gotten steamrolled. That's just the reality of it. So while I think that all those things that the right are saying are in fact where we should be heading, I'm enough of a student of power to say, kind of by analogy, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't kind of win by organizing a bunch of people without noticing that they happened to be black, right? He said he identified actual wrongs that were being done to black people in the United States and organized black people along those lines, along with allied whites, not in the favor of a politics of blackness, although, of course, there were people to his left who wanted to do just that, but along equal rights. I think in the same way, white people have to be not afraid to organize as a group and not just in sort of an exclusive way, but with a multi-ethnic group of allies who also believe in equality before the law and say, hey, you've got to stop discriminating against us as white people. And if you don't do that, you're going to pay a very heavy political price for doing that.
Okay.
And we've got to be unapologetic about this. And I didn't write this book to kind of be a whiner or create another victim class or say white people are victims. It's really, I mean, it's directed toward all people, but it's most directed toward white people to say, hey, get up off the floor, have some self-respect. Don't allow yourself to be treated in this way. Okay.
Yeah.
And having said that, I understand for some of the reasons you just touched on that this is a difficult position sometimes for people because they don't want to take the heat. Believe me, I've taken some, so I know what that's like. But at the same time, like, particularly to the men listening to this, like we got to be men. We got to stand up for ourselves without apology and demand not some sort of special rights because we're white people, but equal rights. And we have to do that by organizing as white people with other people who are not white who want to work with us.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about theory, but I want to bring out some of the material facts of your case. What discrimination could you be talking about? I mean, white people are incredibly privileged. We run this country. We have run this country. We've reaped the benefits. So
Right.
what could possibly be going on to white people?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's important to talk about the facts. So, obviously, historically, white people did run the country. I mean, and this was before the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965. This was just an obvious numbers thing. I mean, you had before in the 1960 census, I think it was 85% white non-Hispanic, 3% Hispanic, 10 or 11% African American, and a tiny, tiny fraction of anything else. So it wouldn't even almost be right to talk about it as white supremacy as much as it was just a white polity. And one of the things I show in my book is that 30 plus states in 1950 or whatever it was were 90 plus percent, 95 plus percent white. So it's just like, of course, white people were running things, right? It was
Yeah.
only this Hart-Celler Immigration Act that really dramatically changed that. Secondly, the kind of notion that white people are sitting on top of the heap, which is promoted certainly by the left, is not really based on an empirical look at the facts of what's going on right now. So Asian Americans, who often get erased from these arguments for political reasons, have higher income, higher education, better health outcomes by a significant margin than the average white American. And what I also show is that if you go look at various other groups, Turkish Americans, Igbo Americans from Nigeria, Venezuelan Americans, all of these groups have higher incomes and in many ways other better social outcomes than the average white person in America. So look, white people are still the substantial portion of adults, so they still have a lot of influence in society. Nobody's arguing otherwise. But this kind of notion that there is this monolithic white group that is somehow sitting on top of the world is just not borne out by the facts. And in fact, the overt discrimination against white Americans is very much borne out by the facts.
Such as what overt
I
discrimination?
mean, you've got affirmative action, which was just struck down in a limited way in the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, I'm skeptical as to how effective that will be. I mean, I'm very glad they did it. A little bit like Roe v. Wade, it was necessary to begin the fight, but it's not sufficient to end it. I think unlike Roe v. Wade, where I think the public opinion is a little bit of a challenge for the right now. I actually think the public opinion is an asset for the right about kind of combating affirmative action. But we've still got a long way to go. You have the same thing going on in the employment sphere. You've got disparate impact. You've got sort of more
What do you mean
things.
by disparate impact?
Disparate impact. So disparate impact
Disparate.
is a doctrine, and this is why, again, I don't beat up the Civil Rights Act quite as much as some other people, because there were things that came after the Civil Rights Act that are causing a great deal of mischief today that are far more they weren't rooted in the text of the act at all. And in fact, if you go back and read the debate in Congress around the act, you'll see that they were basically saying, well, no, we're absolutely not going to do anything like this. It would be wrong. It's not what this act says. And then the Supreme Court or the bureaucracy 5, 10, 15 years later goes and proceeds to do just that. So is that really the fault of the Civil Rights Act, or is it the fault of the deep state in the court? So kind of one of the most extreme examples of this was the case called Griggs versus Duke Power that appeared before the Supreme Court in 1971. And this gave us what's called disparate impact doctrine. What you had there was an employment test that Duke Power had offered to its employees for a particular type of job. It was shown that there was a racially significantly disparate percentage of people who passed that employment test. There was no, this is the real key thing, there was no alleged conduct by Duke Power that this test was being done pretextually, that it was really just a way of discriminating by the basis of race, et cetera. But the Supreme Court rules in Griggs versus Duke Power that if you have this kind of disparity in outcome, that you have to kind of jump through all these hoops about business necessity. And again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to get into all the fine print, but basically you have to do all these things to prove that you're on the right side of the law. And what happens is that most companies look at that, they say, I really don't want anything like that. And so they end up functionally discriminating against whites and to a lesser degree, Asian Americans in some cases, just so that they don't kind of run afoul of these disparate impact lawsuits. And in fact, this case was such an egregious overreach that in 1989, the court, which was not a conservative court back then, effectively reverses themselves. And in a case called Ward's Cove versus Antonio, they basically strike down a lot of the requirements of disparate impact doctrine and make it much less painful. At that point, the civil rights establishment freaks out, and the Bush administration, this is not Bush Jr., but Bush Sr., caves, and they end up effectively writing it into law. And it's interesting because there are some accounts of this from the senior political appointees in DOJ's Civil Rights Division. They knew exactly how bad what they were doing was, but they simply lacked. I mean, H.W. Bush was a spineless wimp, if you'll forgive the he was always hit with that charge, and I think it was a fair one. And
Hmm.
he just lacked the stomach to have that fight. And so we wound up with this now ensconced in the law. So it's things like that that are really baked into the system in some pretty fundamental ways that are discriminatory.
So I like bringing up history a little bit to see the progression of this ideology, or I guess it's not the effect of the Civil Rights Act itself, but of this civil rights ideology, or the people who are fighting
Yeah,
for this. How
yeah.
did they progress after, successively after HW?
Yeah. Well, at first, right, there's an appeal to sympathy, and then at a point past which, and it's legitimate sympathy, right? Like there's no question, and it wasn't just African Americans, but because that was the most predominant minority
Salient.
group at the time, that's the group that people talked about. But they were being held down in many cases, both formally and informally, by the law. And so this was a sympathetic case to a lot of people who were probably in the middle of this debate and saw both sides of it. So they do that until they accumulate enough power. And I'm not suggesting this is necessarily a conspiracy on their part, but probably for some of them it was. They accumulate enough power that then they're deeply invested in this entrenched system of racial preference. So that kind of happens over time. I don't think there's any one thing that you can point to and say, hey, this was the moment in which it all just became a long con. I think it's sort of, starting in the 80s and 90s, we really begin to see things tip the other way. And by the early 2000s, I think they're tipping the other way dramatically. And by 2013, as Obama is reelected, we have what's called the Great Awakening. And that's really when whiteness begins to just be overtly and extremely stigmatized by the system.
Okay. Do you perceive this as a like some sort of long march through the institutions? You just said it's probably not a conspiracy theory, but from
Yeah.
other levels of analysis, if you look at these ideas, these postmodern ideas, incubating
Yeah.
in the institutions and then being promoted, is it because the apparatus of power just uses that to extend itself, or is there some sort of communist revolution that's using race and identity to get its way?
Yeah. I mean, look, power has a lot to do with this. I'm probably a little bit resistant, much more so than most people, to conspiratorial type thinking, and I'm using that in as neutral a way as I
Okay.
can because there are real conspiracies out there. I mean, there's like indubitable, right? I'm just not convinced that this is, all planned by a group of people, rubbing their hands together evilly in a room with like, how can I take down the process? Now, were there people like that? I mean, was the Soviet Union, for example, using the civil rights movement to kind of push for communism and other things? This was a charge actually leveled at Martin Luther King. Yeah, absolutely, that was going on for sure. So there were actors in the political system that were absolutely participating in a conspiratorial way. The question is, were they really the decisive political actors? And in that, I'm a little bit more skeptical. So
Okay.
I think you can understand this perhaps just better, less in terms of conspiratorial actors and more in terms of interest group politics, in the same way that the Democrat Party has left the border of our country wide open because they have perceived correctly that, at least to this point, any minority they can get over the border is disproportionately likely to eventually become a Democrat voter. So I don't need a big conspiracy theory to do that. They're just going and bringing in people who are going to give them power, and that has a lot of really bad knock-on effects, right?
Yeah.
But they're just pursuing power. I don't need to use a conspiracy to
Okay.
explain
Yeah.
what's going on or think that they're trying to somehow nefariously take down the
Yeah,
system.
I don't think that the normal voter, the normal citizen, can really comprehend that the Democrats are actively importing people illegally
Yeah.
in order to gain power. That seems like treason.
Yeah. Well, it is. I've said this. I mean, this is where I even feel a little bit bad saying it because when you say it, it's like all of a sudden you're this extremist. I'm like, no, I'm just describing what's going on. I mean, I wish it weren't the case that the
Yeah.
Democrats were behaving in a way on many issues. And I think one might also say even the lawfare against Trump almost rises to this. And this is regardless of what one thinks about Trump. To me, like whether even you think he's guilty, the question is like, would that case be brought if Trump weren't running for president of the United States? And I think indubitably, if you kind of look at it from the outside, the answer is no. And in which case, they're really kind of fundamentally undermining the system, which is one of the reasons they have so hysterically attacked the right for things like January 6th. And look, I was not in the Capitol building January 6th, but I was sitting on the roof of the Interior Department watching at least some of the demonstrations. And none of us kind of went back thinking, wow, we narrowly avoided this coup plot. We thought, some idiots got out of hand and
Yeah.
behaved like idiots, and that was it.
And
Um,
handed the Democrats just a glorious weapon,
Right,
media-wise. Yeah.
exactly. And so I think that's going on. But yeah, I think that what Joe Biden and the Democrats are doing on immigration amounts to, I mean, if it's not treason, it's something that walks darn close up to the border of it. And it's not the only thing that they're doing that on, but that's the kind of most obvious. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that if you're at least in some degree kind of dedicated to a democratic or quasi-democratic system or the existing system, and you're not trying to Fed post and you're not trying to say, let's burn it all down and like my neighbors in Montana, like let's go get our cache of weapons and just go with that. It's hard. I mean, I'm not saying I have a pat answer. Um, I think the best I can come up with right now is you just have to use the system as best you can while stepping outside of it in maybe some key areas
Hmm.
to really punish the people doing this in a
Yeah.
serious way. It's like putting Hillary in jail, but actually really doing it, because that's what you do when people commit criminal acts, particularly as part of their official duties. Um, so, I
Hmm.
mean, that's, the only other things to contemplate beyond that are really, talking about either bringing down the system or accepting that you are just a second or third class citizen within the system. And
Okay.
neither of those,
Are
particularly the
acceptable.
second, are palatable to me.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you drop these really interesting hits, like stepping out of the system in very key ways. So you believe in the system.
I mean, with big qualifications, I would say that I'm enough of a constitutionally conservative person. I'm not using that in the big C, but just in terms of my makeup,
Okay.
that I am wary of violent revolutions or even non-violent revolutions to feel like you're going to go bring in a new system that's going to be dramatically better to a country that, especially until recently, by any objective standards, without kind of being an American exceptionalist, I think you could say we are probably certainly the most successful modern country. I'm not immediately of the mindset that we just throw that all out based on my clever idea.
Mm.
So I'm
Hmm.
I'm very reluctant to go down that path, not just for a desire not to Fed post, but because that's just kind of how I view things. At the same time, um, I don't shortchange the dire straits that I think we're in. And I think if we just play by the rules that the Democrats are setting, then it's kind of hopeless. So I think we need to again step outside the system a little bit. So there are going to be some ways in which we do some things that the Democrats will perceive as being outside the rules because they're outside the rules that they have been illegally setting for decades. But I would not view them as outside the true system of America's constitutional checks, balances, and power, outside of America's constitutional and historical traditions, things
Hmm.
like that. I do
Yeah.
think we're going to need really tough lawyers in the White House counsel's office in OLC who are willing to get out over their skis and say, yeah, this is actually fine, even though the left is going to scream and yell about it.
Okay. So what do you see as the future if things progress as they have been progressing? Like what is that? Like a second class citizenship for whites? Like officially? Like to what degree? Like South
Yeah.
Africa?
It won't be South Africa for lots of reasons, and I know there's some folks to my right who love to have that kind of very masochistic fantasy, but there's just a lot of different things about the demographics of the US. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify South African demographics because there's lots of tribal politics and Zulu and Cape colored, and there's a lot of different groups in South Africa. But broadly speaking, in South Africa, you've got a white minority that is, I think, in the single digits at this point. It was maybe in the low double digits at the time of the end of the apartheid system. You have an African minority, or majority rather, that is the overwhelming majority of the citizens, and there's not a lot of checks and balances on that power. Even in a future white minority America, that's just not going to be true. I mean, whites are still going to be a very significant percentage of the population. They're still going to have a lot of power. There are still other groups, and I talk about this in the conclusion of my book, that may see it as advantageous to politically ally with white Americans. There may also be what I call white shifting, and I'm borrowing the term white shift from Eric Kaufman, a Canadian scholar of British politics. You're nodding your head, so you may be familiar with his work. But I think, even the kind of notion that whiteness gets legally and culturally encased in amber is not really a typical reading of how societies function under changing demographics. And I actually argue that there are things that we could do to reconstitute a new American ethnic majority by kind of having what you might call multiracial whiteness.
Hmm.
I think that all of these are much more plausible than the kind of catastrophic situation that some people on the further reaches of the right suggest is happening. At the same time, that's going to require white people to actually stand up for themselves.
Hmm.
It's not going to if we continue to allow ourselves to be treated by doormats, we will become doormats. It's just that simple. So I'm not suggesting that there's a narrow, happy, easy road to get there. I'm just saying I think it's more likely that or some sort of Brazil type situation than it is one in which whites are in the single digits and are just a small oppressed minority.
Yeah. Is this multiracial whiteness, does it hinge on ethnicity? Can it hinge on something else? And is that something else an ideology with the kind of the broadness and concreteness of a religion such as Christianity? Is that another vector of how America can go forward in
Sure.
in a good way without descending into
Yeah,
bad?
absolutely. I mean, I think Christianity, I'm a Christian, and I think that Christianity is fundamental to at least historic American identity. And I think various groups have tried to push that away. And it's been to our detriment as a country that we have done that over a long period of time. I've written other articles where I've kind of documented since the 1940s and a variety of really dubious Supreme Court decisions and others that have taken religion and Christianity specifically much further out of the public square than it ever would have. It would have been totally unrecognizable to the founders. I mean, we had state churches, not a state church, but official churches within American states up until the early 1830s in this country. I mean, let alone the idea that, oh my God, we have a nativity scene in some public building. We had a country that was just understood to be a Christian country fundamentally. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to I mean, I have a lot of friends in the kind of Christian nationalist and adjacent community, but I'm not suggesting that we're going to kind of roll back the clock as maybe some of the more enthusiastic folks would say to the sort of 18th century conception of the church's role. But I think that Christianity could absolutely be a a kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic glue. And in fact, you see this in some evangelical churches. And in fact, the evangelical church in particular, um, in many ways integrated before a lot of the rest of society did. The problem is that sometimes this can go too far. And I write about this in the book, and I have an entire chapter on the church where I show that even among the evangelical church, which is a conservative, one of the few bastions of conservatism left in America, that it's been in some cases overrun by social justice principles and equity principles and some of these other things that are directly contrary to actual Christianity. And there's a really terrific pastor named Bodhi Baucham who's written an outstanding book called Fault Lines that I reference a lot in my own book that
Mhm.
kind of just shows how all of this social justice and anti-whiteness and critical race theory is really a substitute for Christian doctrine, and it cannot be upheld in anything that would really call itself a church. And that book sold really, really well, and he has a lot of followers, but there's even within the evangelical church, we do have these problems.
Okay. So I mean, there's a religious aspect to it. There's like kind of a racial aspect to this. And you mentioned or you hinted at a gender aspect to this. Men need to be men. What about those single women? What about the message to women? And this is some people call it the woman question, and they
Yeah,
get a little too focused on bagging on women's
yeah,
bad behavior as it's
yeah,
exploited on the internet, and men are just as is just as foolish as women when we
yeah,
get on the internet and we see that. But what is the
yeah,
message to women and that the
yeah,
conservatives have to give, or at least the trend that you see or want
yeah.
to see implemented
Right.
has?
Well, I mean, it started off with my priors. I mean, I'm a happily married father of five, and I kind of find a lot of this women's bashing. I understand it. I joke I'm a Gen X guy that we and the older millennials. I'm borrowing this from somebody else. You kind of look at the dating market for younger people, and we feel like we caught the last helicopter out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm not trying to say this in a judgmental fashion to those who are engaged in it, but in a spirit of Christian charity that they would check their ways, because I think a lot of this women bashing is really unproductive and it's really low T to kind of use the
Mm,
sort of
hmm.
more.
Yeah.
And what's more, it's like it's actually kind of fundamentally, and I belong to a church that has a complementarian gender roles and an all male leadership and et cetera.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like when I see this, it's like if you're really blaming women, you're not actually patriarchal at all. Because if you're really patriarchal, even if women are kind of the proximate cause of a lot of the problems, and I think it's fair to say sometimes they are, but it's really a failure of male leadership in society that like we have to take that on ourselves. And I'm not doing that to um, remove agency from individual women. I mean, they're responsible for whatever bad choices they might be making that cause society to go
Mm,
in a bad direction, but in a or at least their relationships. But in a structural way, it strikes me that if you really believe in patriarchy, if you really believe in discrete gender roles, et cetera, you've got to place the first blame on men. I mean, men have to be accountable for leadership in society. And I think a lot of the women blaming really goes, even though I understand it, I get it. Like I get that my life was not as horrific in the dating world as it
hmm.
probably is for a lot of young men out there today. But we have to kind of take that type of leadership role without apology. And when we do that, I think women will tend to orient themselves in a way that will be much more
Hmm.
conducive for the flourishing of the family.
Okay, that's yeah. I hear what you're saying. So the left has this picture of the right wanting Handmaid's Tale,
Right.
right?
No.
Women are just breeders. But at the same time that they're doing that, the left is promoting turning women into surrogate mothers, which are basically
Yeah.
the Handmaid's Tale, just with the capitalism
Yeah.
involved, right?
No, and I mean, this
So,
is, I'm not going to get too much into my own family, but anybody who knows my wife, it's the last thing that she would be accused of is being just a handmaid, even though she is
yeah,
the mother of five children. She's also enjoyed a really, significant professional career and is not
yeah.
afraid to make her own decisions, et cetera. So I think it just balance and judgment in a way that we just historically had in the U.S. Um, you know,
Hmm.
rather than kind of some rigid, fixed doctrine about
Yeah.
this must be this way in a really extreme way. When you do that, it's a sign you've lost control to me. Like if
Oh.
you actually have control, it's just like a man who in general has control, they're not emotionally labile. I mean, they're just like when you're screaming about women or saying like you're
Or
blaming her
even
feminism, it's
same
sort of,
same thing with race. When you start
yeah.
to victimize yourself as a white person, you're playing
Right.
into the same thing that led you to be aggrieved in the first
Right,
place.
and this is one of the reasons why I've said, I mean, I think a politics of whiteness is inferior, and you have to thread a needle, right? Like because at the same time, the left wants to use that to really kind of get back to the subject of my book to say like, hey, then you can't talk about the fact that we're actively screwing you. And I'm like, no, I am going to talk about it. My solution is just not, even if it may involve organizing white people, it's not a politics of whiteness. And to
Okay.
me, those two things are very distinct.
What do you think with regard? This is kind of stepping out, but I think that when we're talking about these issues, there's just it all touches and tangles into itself, like social justice or even anti-social justice. It's touching on all these different vectors of what it is to be an American, a man, a woman, a white person, whatever, or a
Yeah.
racialized person, whatever. What do you think with regard to the rights? Paucity of cultural clout, specifically in the arts and
Yeah.
media. Is that a problem? Why is that a problem? How does that go about being eroded?
Yeah, well, I think it's a huge problem. And in fact, I'm very close personal friends with Lomez, this guy who was just doxxed to, I mean, we're basically neighbors in Montana. He lives a half hour plus away from me, but
Yeah.
by Montana standards, that is like, he might as well be my next door neighbor. And he had really pushed these issues. I mean, his politics are a little different than mine, maybe a little edgier. He kind of
Yeah.
comes out of a non-world and I come more out of a more traditional political world, but I've been very involved in trying to help him with the broader cultural project that I think he's trying to kind of do with Passage Press, which I think is really he and his partners. It's really wonderful. It's an understanding that we need to have elite cultural production on the right, and that it's incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah.
And I think he's stepped into that space and done some really interesting things with the Passage Prize and with some of the authors that he's been publishing. And I think it's a hugely underserved market. I think it's really, really important that we have people stepping into that space. And again, as somebody who spent almost 2 decades at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford in these elite
Yeah.
left-wing cultural spaces, I understand how much power the left's control of the cultural apparatus gives them, and our willingness to kind of just cede that power to them is a huge, huge mistake. And I actually wrote a long piece in the American Conservative a few years back that got quite a bit of attention, called "Towards a Republican Counter Elite," where I kind of talked about what that would look like. And I think there is a large cultural dimension
Hmm.
to that. And it's one of the reasons that I spend time in spaces like this talking to folks like yourself, who I think are
Yeah.
very interested in these issues. And I'm not just kind of like, well, I mean, I know you have actually a very good sized audience as well, but like, I'm not just kind of like, well, how can I get in front of the maximum sized audience, right? It
Yeah.
also matters what type of audience you're cultivating,
Yeah.
and trying to cultivate an audience that is serious about these issues and thinks about them seriously.
Well, speaking as an insider, because you kind of seem like an insider, where do you see the right going? What is the possibility space right now
For the
for
right,
the political right, both in the system and then maybe leaping out,
right,
or like some sort of arcing outside of the system for an
yeah.
actual resurgence of, I guess, the cultural and
Yeah.
political project that you envision, that you want to
Yeah.
have happen?
Well, I think politically, the people who say the GOP is largely a fake opposition party are correct. I mean, they talk about them being the Washington Generals to the Democrats' Harlem Globetrotters. It's a phrase I've used myself, and I think it's actually accurate. At the same time, I think it's important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then not only are there a surprising number of congressmen who would actually like to be an effective opposition force, and it's good to use their skills where we can. I think at the staff level, there's often, again, even a greater sense of understanding that we need to do more. I'm actually going to be talking about my book to a significant number of congressmen. I'll kind of leave that general. There's also, I can tell you, several congressmen who've already read it.
Okay.
So, like the kind of
And they're
notion that
listening to you.
yeah, like the notion that I'm just shouting into the wind. I mean, this book sold really well, right? It's not been out quite a month yet as we tape this, but I went into 3 printings within 12 days, which, if you know about the publishing business, that's really good.
Hmm.
And it sold as many copies in the first week as I kind of had as my soft goal for the first year. So
Hmm.
I think people are paying attention to the
Yeah.
unprotected
Yeah.
class, and that's terrific. I actually have, I don't know when this will appear, but later this week I have a interview dropping with a very, very, very significant kind of figure in Republican politics. So I think people are paying attention, and that's great, even if the kind of establishment of the Republican Party is still frustratingly inept and impotent. And I think there's a good argument that we won't really get much of anything done through them, but that doesn't mean that we should divest ourselves of the formal political process. So that's
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
We kind of have to. I worked for a decade when I was at Hoover with the late Secretary of State George Shultz, who was kind of an avatar of the establishment, although he'd been Reagan's Secretary of State. And one of the things that he said, even though I was much more conservative than he was, that I think is useful, as he would say, based on a career that spanned. Um, I mean, he got his start on the Council of Economic Advisors in the first Eisenhower administration and was a significant player up to his death at age 100 in the Biden administration. So a guy who, like, whatever you thought of his politics, he'd seen it all. And he said, Jeremy, you can never tell when the moment is going to come politically for the thing that you're trying to do. And so
Mm.
you just have to be ready. And, he would mean that you kind of like, you have the legislation ready to go. You have all these other things ready to go. And people who want to solve every problem with one brilliant stroke today often get frustrated with that type of advice. But I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. And so we have to be ready. On the broader cultural space, it's replicating the things that folks like Lomez are doing, or even folks who are less edgy, but who are just out there trying to have a mainstream right-wing cultural space. And I think that the good news there is the left has just become so lame as they've taken over the cultural space.
Thankfully.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's so painful. Like the stuff they just do is bad. The art is bad, the music is bad, and everybody with any integrity knows it. And so there is, even in like the dime square scene in New York, but even going beyond that, there's a sense that truly to be rebellious against that requires a certain right-wing frame of some type. And all we need to do is make it not super cringe,
Yeah.
right? And by the way, that doesn't mean like we're going to have, I'm not going to name names, but we're going to have mainstream Republican cultural production on the right that is maybe going to be a little bit cringe, but there's actually a value even in that, as long as it's not completely pathetic, because you need reasonable mass entertainment that is right coded. And I think that's okay. I
Okay.
don't look down at that. I
Okay.
don't
Yeah.
say that that can't be part of the cultural project, even if it's not appealing maybe to the elite. It still gives an alternative to like network TV and whatnot. And I think that's important when we're trying to reach a mass audience.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the general sense that you may be getting as you're talking to me, or at least the sense that I think of myself in, is I'm very broad church. I think we need lots of different political actors. We need the dissidents out in their dissident space. We need the quasi dissidents. We'll even need an establishment at some point. And my study of political power just suggests you need all of those actors. And the only people who I'm really actively against on our side, and unfortunately it's a big group, are the people who are just actively trying to undermine us. And I think of guys like Mitch McConnell kind of falling into that bucket, and the people around him with his immigration bill that just completely kneecapped our
Yeah.
candidates, and the other people who really are just happy to be the handmaidens to the left. I mean, those people we can't work with. But there's a lot of people who I don't feel go strongly enough, or I feel like they go too strong, but I still consider them 80% my friend and not 20% my enemy. And to me, that's just how you should conduct politics.
Okay.
So.
Well, what's your advice to normies?
Yeah.
And this advice would be, leading toward the political project and the culture that you want to establish in this
Yeah,
country.
well, in many ways, I mean, I've given this book, look, my book has been endorsed by Tucker Carlson, it's been endorsed by Charlie Kirk, it's been endorsed by kind of guys like Victor Davis Hanson and Heather McDonald, who've kind of been in and around these issues. And those people are not kind of like on the extreme right, but I'd say that they are all about as far right as you could be on a lot of these issues while still being somewhere in the mainstream discourse, right? So I think I've gotten a lot of support. But my book is not, even though I've definitely gotten some very, for those of people who read more edgelordy discourse, you'll see there are a lot of people in that discourse, and I've been very gratified by this. I think the ones who are a little more savvy about politics have been very complimentary of my book, and I really appreciate that. But I've also kind of not just done this book for them, but like for them to give this book to their mother or their pastor or their friend who's like not totally convinced. That's almost who I've written the book most for. Most of all, I want to convince them that there's actually a problem that we need to address here. And I know that I'm not going to do that by like immediately revving up the engine to 11 and
Yeah.
just throwing out hate fact after hate fact in a way that would be like really emotionally satisfying to people on the
Yeah.
further reaches of the right, but is not going to convince that median voter that I feel that I need to convince. So that's who I've really targeted this to. And I think the feedback I've gotten has been great. I mean, just go on Amazon, you'll see, right? Like I don't have
Yeah.
any other than one troll. I literally don't have a single negative review of the book. So I think that I've done a good job within this book of trying to speak to both of those
Yeah.
audiences.
But behavioral wise, as a
Yeah.
citizen, what do you advise people
Yeah.
to do? Go to church,
So
have a
I would not
family? Like
abandon
what is it?
I would not abandon the political project. And I would actually
Okay.
offer Trump as a classic example of this. And it's also why you shouldn't do anything stupid like create some third party or anything like that. In that Trump realized what is much better to do is just like take over the existing party and engraft your own ideology on it. I mean, and that's what he effectively did. Now, he doesn't quite always have the discipline to really be as effective at that as sometimes I would like him to be, but he has moved a lot of the
Mhm.
party institutionally, even just through the force of his personality, just by coming in and saying, hey, guess what? This is the Republican position now. And so he's gone after the consensus on foreign policy or the consensus on trade. And of course, there are a lot of people who will kind of remain in crypsis who still are going after the old orthodoxy, who managed to maintain a lot of influence under Trump. And I think what we have to hope for is a successor to Trump who is more ruthless and more strategic than Trump even is. And I
Yeah.
think that's not fanciful. I can see people out on the horizon who I think they maybe don't have some of Trump's strengths, but they have that strength. So I would say participate. Don't be afraid. It's true that we're not going to vote our way out of this, but you're also not going to completely avoid anything resembling power politics and actually somehow magically just wish your way into political power. Or maybe
Mhm.
I could say the only way you're going to do that is going to involve things that would be pure Fed posting. And that's not the
Mhm.
project that I'm engaged in. If other people want to engage
Okay.
in that, good luck to them. But I would say it matters to get involved in the process, and you can actually have a lot of effect on the process by simply being there, by kind of taking over your local Republican precinct, by doing other things, and it really does matter to even. I always encourage people to get involved in mainstream politics, and the notion that you just automatically cave or you lose all your principles, it's not true. I mean, there without naming names, there are some of our strongest senators. I got at least a little bit involved with when they were candidates, and everybody said, "Oh well, they compromised a little bit on X and Y, and so they'll be totally useless once they get into office." And in fact, no, that's not the case. Like once you actually get into office, they can be a real thorn in the establishment side, and nobody can get rid of them, or at least it's really hard. I mean,
Mm.
there's some of these guys have sailed now to multiple re-elections, and they've really been very helpful. And my problem is not that they don't do enough, but that I wish I had 20 of them rather than five of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what's next on your plate? What's the future hold for you, work
Well,
wise,
I
project
mean,
wise?
I think this book has been received about as well as I could have possibly hoped. I'm still kind of hoping that I can. One of the reasons I'm talking to a lot of folks is I'm hoping I can get it to that next level where it goes beyond just being a big success in conservative world that gets talked about there, but that I have a New York Times journalist going after me about it, right? Because they don't like it. Like that's
Yeah.
the kind of next step where they just can't ignore it anymore. So I think that actually is still very much within the possibility set for this book, less than a month out, just given how well it's done.
Mm.
So there's some successor books that I'd like to write about this.
Like something
As
like the
actually,
new Jim Crow? Would that be a
yeah. Well, it's actually so I think there's sort of two. Um, One of which I kind of had and have already sort of started working on to a degree in mind even before this book went to market, and another one that's kind of come in as I've seen the reception for this book. The sort of first of those was the kind of um, looking particularly at the white left as the kind of particularly toxic group in the current American context. And by that, I'm not trying to give um, minority political actors a free pass, but I think at least they're sort of more understandable why they behave in the way they behave. Whereas the way that the white left has kind of been a uniquely toxic cultural group in America they need to be put under the microscope and they need to be called to account in a more vigorous way. So that's kind of one book that I'm sort of have already sketched out to a degree. The second is I've gotten a tremendous amount of interest from Europeans about this book, and I've already done a number of interviews. I'm going to do some more. Very few of them have dropped to this point, but they're kind of in the pipeline. These things always kind of take a
Yeah.
little longer outside of you and me chatting when you're dealing with major media organizations. They take kind of longer to go through the pipeline. So I think something that kind of looked at anti-whiteness in a global context is a book that I've come to feel in the process of doing 60 interviews or whatever it's been on this book. I feel like the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Your take on
Excuse me.
race, how you speak about,
Excuse me.
bless you,
Yeah, I'm
the way
good.
that, you okay? The way you speak about race, it doesn't feel charged at all. It's just the tone that you speak about it. It's just very matter of factly, very
Yeah,
plainly,
yeah,
very forthrightly. And I think that that
yeah,
is one way that you are threading the needle
yeah,
tonally, and it's an
yeah.
important aspect.
Well, and that's exactly what I tried to do, right? And so there's a group, I won't even mention them here, but people, if they're sort of on the further edges, they will know them or at least are familiar.
But
But I
Stormfront,
not st I don't know, will not name them. I don't even know what they're saying truly, but like there's a group that's well more on the racial identitarian side than I would be, and they wrote about my book that basically of the 34 years they'd been in existence, they had never seen a mainstream book on race that had pulled so few punches as this one. And, I took that as a badge of honor because I didn't try to pull punches. And at the same time, the reason that I've been able to talk about this book in the mainstream is because without pulling punches, I'm also not trying to be histrionic. I'm not trying to complain. I'm not trying to, create new victim classes. I'm not trying to be an edgelord about it. I'm just trying to present facts. And because I think I am very matter of fact in how I'm presenting this, and people can sense there's not some deep animus or some desire to
hmm,
like throw away the entire American system that undergirds what I'm saying. I think I've gotten a more respectful consideration within the mainstream. And that was very much my goal, was to write a book that even people who would be at all fair on the sort of further right of this issue would not say, this guy's just cucking out, he's nothing.
yeah.
But that I could still go and make a very mainstream argument because, here's the secret. This should be a mainstream issue. We don't need to be scared of talking about this issue. That's like the secret weapon of this is nothing I'm saying is like should be that radical. It's just that the left has tried to force it into a very radical space. And I'm saying, no, this should actually just be something that we should be talking about in the mainstream. So
Which is, just to summarize, which is what? What's the message?
that anti-white racism, anti-white discrimination are a really, really big problem in American society, and we need to do something about it. We shouldn't be putting up with the status quo. That's like my core thesis. Um, and I think that should be a mainstream thesis. And the reason why it should be a mainstream thesis is because it's true.
Hmm.
And that's what I document in great painstaking detail with almost 1,000 citations within the book. And if folks on the further reaches of the right love that, that's great. If folks in the mainstream love that, that's great. I'm trying to speak to a mainstream audience. I think everybody should love that because it's correct. My thesis is correct. That's this great superpower that I have. The truth does still matter, at least a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to put it as much as I can in this book.
Mr. Carl, thank you very much for your time. This book is excellent. Your mind is excellent too. It's been a pleasure to poke your brain and get it going on my show. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. And let me just do my like shameless plug here at the end, if
Oh,
you'll
plug
permit
away.
me.
Plug.
So book again, because I don't think we went over it that much. It's called The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. It's available now on Amazon or Thrift Books or wherever you get books. It's also it does have retail distribution, so you may be able to find it in your local Barnes and Noble or wherever. And if you're interested in that, I would really encourage you. Even if you think, well, maybe this guy, I'm glad he's talking about this, but he doesn't have it quite right. The advantage you have in buying a book like this, it doesn't make me rich. I just make a few bucks per copy. Believe me, it's kind of scandalous how the publishing industry works. But what it does do is it sends a message to the mainstream publishers. And I was fortunate to have a mainstream publisher for this book that this sort of issue is important. that we should talk about it, that we should have more people write books about it because there's a market for people who want to read that. That at the end of the day is like what publishers care about is like, can we sell copies of this book? So I would really encourage folks, if they think that I've said anything at all useful here, to go buy the book and read it and make up your mind for yourself about how good a job you think I've done. But beyond that, you can go to Real Jeremy Carl, which is my Twitter/X handle, or my Substack, jeremycarl.substack.com, called The Course of Empire. That's newer, and I try to talk about these issues there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to go talk to you today, and hopefully your audience will think I've said a few things that are interesting.
Yeah. Do you seriously never Fed post? Not even just a little bit?
I don't have an Anon. I've never had an Anon. Again, I have good friends like Lomez who are in the Anon space. It's actually
Post
sort of
Anon
been
friend.
interesting to see things through his eyes. And at a point, this is actually interesting. And we've got a few minutes before I've got to run to my next thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You gotta go.
I'll mention this because I think it's indicative of, because I was really a personal friend of his beyond kind of whatever political agreements or disagreements we might have had. It's interesting to talk to him as he kind of realized, as like, wow, I've got a real publishing company with real investors and real buyers, that there were ultimately limits to what he was going to be able to do without being a face. And separate from this scuzzy guy from the Guardian, who God will get him in the end, who decided to dox him, he had been making sort of small things where he'd been appearing under his name, under his face, with the publicly, because he realized ultimately to really get to that next level of influence, you can't just Fed post. It's really fun. I get it if you feel disempowered in the system. I really do. I have been disempowered in my earlier life within this system, so I know how frustrating it is. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't feel frustrated, but like at a certain point, even though of course the founders at times used pseudonyms, so I'm not saying you can't do that, but you do need to go to meet space and exist under your own real name, with an address and everything that's attached to it, with all the risks that come with that. There is no substitute in the ultimate political system if you really want to take power for doing that for some people, even though, again, I've got lots of friends in the Anon
Yeah.
space, and I'm not trying to tell them they need to self-dox or whatever, but it's really like there are a lot of Anons who don't really need to be Anon. It would be unpleasant for them not to be Anon, but not
Yeah.
fatal. And I would encourage those people that there's no substitute for kind of being out in the world under your own
Yeah.
name. There's a great power
Yeah.
that goes with that. And so I've never really, other than kind of one innocuous time in the far distant past, and I wasn't doing any like super edgelordy things, but I've never used pseudonyms or anons to write any of my stuff. I've always done it with my name and address, and even the stuff where I might have like sort of Fed posted a little bit. I do it with my name because it's a great disciplining function to kind of have that. It's like, oh, I can't just like
Yeah.
say go into Washington D.C. in the Capitol building and gun down everybody, right? Because like people will show up at my doorstep when I do that, and so it's a great disciplining thing that makes you say things that are more real and less just emotionally kind of outbursts that may reflect your frustration.
Well, yeah,
So
it causes you to have
there's
skin in the game, in the very
there's
least.
skin in the game. There's no secret Fed Post world out there. I mean, I have gotten hit, but I mean, the left has attacked me. I've been attacked in the Washington Post. I've been attacked by members of Congress. It's not that you don't get these hits. You do, but like I kind of sleep well knowing that like what I have is out there. It's under my own name. I'm not hiding from it. And I think that there's power in that. And again, I understand. I'm not judging. Again, I've got lots of friends in the Anon space, but I do encourage folks, as much as is practicable for you in your life, to think about at least having a significant amount of your political activity under your name and face. It really does make a difference.
Are you going to tell us your address, or do you stop shy of that?
I don't tell my address, but I'm sure like, bad actors could find it. I'm armed,
Yeah.
so like I'm not like totally panicked about that. I live in Montana. You're not going to get a lot of sympathy from my neighbors if you show up with your left-wing protests. My neighbors, I think, are reasonably well aligned with my way of looking at the world. So that helps. That helps Lomez too, living out where we live. But it's not for everyone. I'm truly not trying to judge. Everybody's got their own situation. I'm just trying to offer my advice based on somebody who's participated in politics in a variety of different ways pretty seriously. To consider like different ways that you can participate.
Thank you again, Mr. Carl. You have a busy day. Thank you very much for your time. It's been excellent to speak with you.
Absolutely, it's a real pleasure to speak with you as well.